Welcome and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to our PhD seminar series in business management. And in a special way, I want to welcome you to our sixth workshop. And if you recall, in the fifth workshop, we really covered very interesting things, of course, under the major topic of navigating the PhD terrain. We did look at how you can actually identify a PhD research topic, how you can identify a research gap, and how you can identify a research problem. In this workshop, ladies and gentlemen, I want to still continue with the same topic of navigating the PhD terrain, but placing much emphasis on developing a theoretical gap, making a theoretical contribution, and linking theory to practice. I know that in the previous lecture, I talked about a theoretical gap, but this time we want to take another deeper look or examination of this thing, ladies and gentlemen. And the structure of our workshop and the presentation, ladies and gentlemen, will actually be as follows. We'll give you an introduction. Then I'll take you through theory of knowledge. Briefly, these are some of the things that we have covered under the philosophy of science series. I'll take you to what we call locating and or developing a research gap. How do I locate a research gap? How do I develop this research gap? And then thereafter, I shall go to making a theoretical contribution, and then look at linking theory to practice, and then conclusion, ladies and gentlemen. Our lecture, again, as I've always said, will be slightly short because we usually, we don't want to keep you for a very long time. We want you to really master these things. But you know, learning cannot take place in a tensed up environment. So relax wherever you are, and I hope you'll be able to pick most of the things that we have in this workshop. And if there are a number of questions that do come up, please feel free to document those questions, and at an appropriate moment we shall have an opportunity to discuss these things. Now, we need to understand the industry that we are in. When you join the doctoral program, ladies and gentlemen, you join a group of scholars, or you start your journey that will result into joining that group of scholars. Therefore, our concern is actually to create knowledge. So as a PhD student, you are going to create knowledge. And as a PhD student, you're expected to provide solutions to practical problems. So therefore, when you undertake research, you will be making a contribution to literature, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, this contribution that you're going to make to literature, it needs to be interesting. This contribution must be relevant, meaning that you must actually take care when you are trying to think about your area of study and when you are developing a research gap, ladies and gentlemen. Now, as you are aware, developing a research argument is not very simple, but at the PhD level, you will be advancing an argument. And here we are talking about a research argument. So, and scientists and academics seek to advance knowledge by using data to present an argument. So you have an argument. When you come up with a topic, that topic summarizes the argument that you have. When you go into conceptualization and developing a conceptual model, ladies and gentlemen, still you will be thinking about the argument that you are trying to promote. So scientists really seek to advance knowledge by using data to present an argument. And indeed, academic writing seeks to express an argument and by supporting it with evidence. And if you recall from our lectures in the philosophy of science, where we did talk about knowledge and also talking about the truth, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to talk about the truth, if you're going to talk about knowledge, you're talking about justified true beliefs. So in a way of qualifying your argument, you must provide evidence to support what you are talking about. And I think you can see academic writing in this case seeks to express an argument, and by supporting that argument with, of course, evidence. And this has been the foundation for the development of human knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So developing a research argument then is an important element, and the moment you do that, the major objective and achievements you will have at the end of the day will be seen in terms of the dogmas that you would have challenged. So that discipline that takes you into research and that process that you follow will challenge dogma. So your job is to challenge dogma using argumentative research papers. And of course, the moment you do that, you'll be able to advance new theories and challenge antiquated ideas, ladies and gentlemen. So development of an argument becomes very important. But this argument that we are talking about, which is a research argument, of course, has certain features. And I want to take you through features of an effective argument. Ladies and gentlemen, an effective argument is well-grounded and supported by relevant data. So you cannot talk about an argument that you are advancing, especially in the background of your paper, without providing relevant data. So you must support the argument, and your argument must be well-grounded and supported by data, by relevant data, not any kind of data, but relevant data. Again, as you can see, presenting an effective argument does not involve mere participation, but also contribution to an existing argument or scholarship in the field. And that's why you must be involved in an extensive and critical review of literature, because the moment you do that, you'll be able to identify research gaps. You will be able to see how far knowledge has developed in this area and the kinds of arguments that these people have advanced. And therefore, your argument must be built on an existing argument. In other words, you must be able to craft or come up with something new in that particular discipline, ladies and gentlemen. So a fruitful academic argument, ladies and gentlemen, defends against rational counter-arguments promoted by experts in defense of their perspective. So every expert will have a perspective, but of course you must be able to build on what exists somewhere. And again, this leads us to an important element that I covered in the theory of knowledge, that is the philosophy of science. But since we are dealing with these aspects in this workshop setting and trying to discuss them in light of the research perspectives, and since our concern is actually developing a research gap and also making a theoretical contribution, ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand what the theory of knowledge is all about. And these are really epistemic justifications and epistemic decisions that we seek to make, ladies and gentlemen. So the theory of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, whenever we start talking about this theory of knowledge, we understand that the theory of knowledge is about examination of the world around us. And of course, in this case, we look at what makes up the things we think of as knowledge. And when we know something, we need to understand and be able to defend that we know, and also tell people how we know that we actually know, and how we know that what we know is actually true, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, this theory of knowledge helps us to examine our lives and helps us to be critical of knowledge claims, because scholarship is actually very rich with knowledge claims in this case, ladies and gentlemen. So, of course, at the end of the day, we defend those things, and we are very critical because we know that we are dealing with beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. Knowledge is justified through beliefs. So we engage in an exercise of discussing, dismissing, and of course also discovering error and dismissing error, ladies and gentlemen. And it's only research that helps us to do so, and therefore we need to understand that very well. So we ask a central question, and this has been a central question in philosophy. What do we know, ladies and gentlemen? So you must be able to go into and dig deep into these journal articles for you to understand what is there. So, and what we find in those journal articles, which are written and published, are knowledge claims, ladies and gentlemen. Knowledge claims are claims made by someone when they say that they know something. And of course, we know the world we know is made completely up of knowledge claims. How do we know if these knowledge claims are representative of reality? As I have already intimated, ladies and gentlemen, in my lectures of models and modeling in the philosophy of economics, I have already told you that, you know, reality is complex, but at the end of the day, we must be able to construct. So we go into the construction process, but usually the symbols that we use, the concepts that we use to understand reality out there and construct models, ladies and gentlemen, may not be able to capture everything that we want to capture out there. So the number of assumptions that we make when we are doing that. So again, we need to verify, we need to validate, and we need to discuss these knowledge claims, ladies and gentlemen, because every individual who comes up with these things certainly will tell you that this is knowledge, and when the moment they do so, they are telling you that this is the truth. And I will give you an example to prove the point that I'm talking about, and this is the example of the physicist and astronomer known as Galileo Galilei. And I hope you still remember that gentleman, a famous physicist and astronomer. And again, just to give you a background for you to understand this fellow, Galileo's initial discoveries were met with the opposition from the Roman Catholic Church. Galileo was ordered to turn himself into the Holy Office to begin trial for holding the belief that the earth revolves around the sun. And of course, that was Galileo's thinking. The earth revolves around the sun, which was deemed heretical by the Catholic Church. And of course, that was what he had in his mind and what he thought. But the Roman Catholic Church was actually teaching different things, totally different from his thinking. So what happens around this time is that when he was told to report to the Holy Office, he actually did not really understand why it was necessary for him to go to the Holy Office. But of course, it's because it was believed that he was actually teaching heresy, ladies and gentlemen. So Galileo, we see, refused to accept church orthodoxy that the earth was the immovable center of the universe. For a very long time, the Catholic Church believed that the earth was the immovable center of the universe. And the church had the idea that the sun moved around the earth. Right, and this was an absolute fact of scripture that could not be disputed, despite the fact that scientists had known for centuries that the earth was not the center of the universe, ladies and gentlemen. So we see Galileo challenging. So when we talk about research and the theory of knowledge, the Catholic Church knew that But Galileo went ahead to disprove this kind of thing. And today, we actually believe in Galileo's ideas, ladies and gentlemen. So the theory of knowledge is just that, a theory, ladies and gentlemen. It's not called the facts of knowledge, and there is not one answer to questions regarding knowledge. There are countless theories about what knowledge actually is. The nature of knowledge is so that a human being's subjective perspective of the world will to some degree influence what he or she calls knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why, again, we go back to the works of Plato, right, who lived a long, long time ago, one of those celebrated philosophers, ladies and gentlemen, of course, who defined knowledge as justified true belief. Of course, meaning that P, which is a proposition, we're talking about propositional knowledge, P must be true. And of course, I believe P, that means I believe a proposition P. I have sound reasons for believing P, that proposition, and I need a type of justification, and I have no evidence that negates or erodes my belief in P. And that's what is considered to be knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, if you recall in my lecture 23, of course now we are dealing with workshops in this area, but in my lectures in the philosophy of science, I did present another person who has challenged that theory of knowledge, and that is Gettier, who did this in 1963, ladies and gentlemen. So research is very important. Now, of course, we've got sound reasons for knowledge. When people tell you that they believe in that proposition, right, of course, they must be having sound reasons for knowledge. And these are called justifications for calling something knowledge. And of course, these are based on things like perception, self-awareness. And self-awareness is just conscious knowledge of one's own character and feelings. Of course, other things like deduction will also influence our thinking. And of course, when we talk about deduction, we mean making conclusions based on premises that are known to be true. And of course, other things will include induction. And of course, under induction, we actually claim that this claiming that knowledge about future events can't be known. So in other words, when you talk about induction, it is claiming knowledge about future events based on past experiences, ladies and gentlemen. So this is very important, and of course, that is what we have under sound reasons, ladies and gentlemen. So the question we are faced with in this workshop is really identifying research gaps. Of course, if you recall, in my previous workshop, which was workshop 5, I did talk about these issues, right? And I hope you remember what I said. So if you're going to identify research gaps, certainly it's very important that you review literature. Literature is very, very, very important. So you will actually go to journal articles, right? And pick these journal articles where you really have an interest, and you pick these journal articles and read. Now, of course, as you're aware, in the process of reading, right, you'll come across a number of things. But at the end of the day, you'll be expected to construct literature and problematize the literature. And of course, these are the ideas that I presented in my previous lecture. When I told you that you've got scholars who have challenged the traditional way of identifying research gaps, and they did indicate that you cannot actually be able to challenge the assumptions of a theory just using those traditional means. And of course, remember, one of them was Alessandro and Alveri. Those fellows actually, in 2011, they challenged the traditional way and system and belief and the procedure of identifying research gaps. Now, just to take you to literature and to supplement the ideas of those scholars, we construct literature, right? And that's why we get the most recent, in literature we review the most recent, the most relevant and scholarly writings, ladies and gentlemen. So first of all, relevant. Relevant to what? Relevant to the topic that you are investigating, right? And two, must be recent, right? We are talking about the most recent publications and publications made in the last 5 years. But of course, you can also review theories and the classical pieces of works which were published a long time ago in the 1920s or 18 or 17. And you know those particular books which are very classical that you cannot actually ignore, like Adam Smith, right? The Theory of Moral Sentiments, plus a number of other things. So you may be able to review that kind of literature. Now, of course, when we say the most recent, in terms of journal articles, we are talking about the last 5 years. So we begin with the 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017, and 2016. I'm not saying that you may not refer to some of the 1970s, but if you want to get the current debate in literature, literature journal articles published in the last 5 years will be quite useful in this case. So when you read and understand, at the end of the day, you will be required to construct the literature. And of course, Gordon, Biddle, and Locke have given us guidelines on how to do that. So the literature review actively constructs the field of your research, ladies and gentlemen. And Gordon, Biddle, and Locke, 1997, researched the major ways that researchers construct their research fields. And they discovered that researchers construct their research fields using 3 approaches. And the first one is what he calls, or what they call, not he, but what they call synthesized coherence. And the second one is what they call progressive coherence. And the third one is what they call non-coherence, ladies and gentlemen. So let me just address those 3 issues for a moment. Under synthesized coherence, this approach brings together previously unrelated work. And of course, this approach highlights points of agreement in order to demonstrate the need for further investigation. And in this mode, ladies and gentlemen, the review of literature highlights common concepts, it highlights common methodologies, it highlights perspectives, of course, within apparently disparate fields of research. So in other words, you may, if you're undertaking a study in psychology, not in psychology, you're undertaking research in entrepreneurship, for instance, you may review literature that has been published in the area of psychology. You may also review literature that has been published in humanitarian logistics, for instance, and also review literature in accounting and finance, literature in marketing, and so forth. So these are really disparate fields of research. But of course, at the end of the day, you'll acknowledge the common concepts, the common methodologies, and the perspectives within these disparate fields of study, ladies and gentlemen. And that's what we call synthesized coherence. Now, the second approach is the progressive coherence. Now, of course, progressive coherence depicts the literature in terms of cumulative knowledge growth. And of course, you are looking at a certain topic. Let me just give you an example. If, for instance, you are studying a concept of resilience, right? You will discover that maybe the concept of resilience is a relatively new concept. And of course, first of all, emerging out of, for instance, disasters, and also from child psychology and in other fields. So if you're looking at resilience in organizations, for instance, you may indicate the cumulative knowledge growth in organizations. So you can even say, well, this area is relatively new and started in the last 2 decades. And then you say, well, in the 1980s, these are the issues that were being addressed. In the 1990s, these are the issues. In the 2000s, these are the issues. So you indicate or you document the cumulative knowledge growth, and then you also document the consensus or perspectives, and also methods. And of course, a well-developed and a focused line of inquiry in this case, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, after you've done that, you may make a statement and say, the current research is constructed as the next logical step in this collective and growing understanding of the topic, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what it is. And the third method is that of non-coherence or approach. And ladies and gentlemen, under non-coherence, non-coherence constructs the literature in terms of points of disagreements within a research program whose importance is commonly accepted. And this approach emphasizes both the continuous nature of the field, but also competing explanations and disputes, debates, or contradictions in the methodological approaches and the findings of concepts adopted. And therefore, at that material time, you can make a statement and say, the research, that means the research you are undertaking, situates itself within a contested field. And of course, you'll be able to state the aim of your research in terms of resolving or shedding light upon the debate, ladies and gentlemen. So that is what we have. So of course, according to Gordon Beetle, you construct literature in terms of the synthesized coherence, progressive coherence, and non-coherence. Now, of course, the next thing that you must do, ladies and gentlemen, because you are interested in the research gap, is to problematize the literature, right? You have studied, you have reviewed literature, you understand literature very well, therefore you must problematize that literature. And again, Gordon Beetle, Locke, 1997, they summarize the key ways that researchers problematize the literature. And of course, these three ways are incomplete, inadequate, and incommensurate, ladies and gentlemen. And this is quite important. And I'm going to attempt to articulate what these people say, Gordon Beetle and Locke. So under incomplete here, the literature is portrayed as not fully finished in some specific area. And therefore, the research that you are undertaking as a scholar, as a researcher, as a PhD student, the research that you're undertaking seeks to augment the field or fill a gap rather than question its reigning paradigms in any significant ways, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at now the inadequate element, which is the second one. So here, the literature is portrayed as excluding alternative perspectives. And of course, meaning that your research aims to contribute by bringing this oversight into view and introduce different views and frameworks, ladies and gentlemen. So in this inadequate perspective or problematization, existing paradigms are not so much questioned as extended and improved, ladies and gentlemen. So that takes us to the third way of problematizing literature, and that is really incommensurate. So here, existing research is portrayed as not simply incomplete, but wrong or misguided in some way. So the existing research seeks to overthrow existing views or paradigms in the field and to posit an alternative. And of course, in this case, you need to understand these things very well. And how does your own review of literature problematize and construct the field of your research? And these are things that you must really think about. If you want to identify research gaps and you are going to undertake these studies, remember you must construct literature, and there are three ways of constructing literature. Use the synthesized coherence, use the progressive coherence, And then the third one is noncoherence. But at the end of the day, if you are going to problematize, because after constructing literature, you problematize literature as incomplete, you problematize literature as inadequate, and you problematize literature as incommensurate, ladies and gentlemen. So from this point onwards, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take you to another level of locating and developing a research gap. How do we locate and how do we develop the research gap? Now, the idea of finding gaps in the literature has been troubling for most researchers. And of course, there are also conflicts about this. One researcher's gap may not be another researcher's gap, ladies and gentlemen. So one researcher's gap may be another researcher's non-gap. To put it crudely that way. And the majority of this conflict with research gaps tends to tread on perception. Remember, that's one of the things that I did present here under the theory of knowledge, right? You call something knowledge because of your perception. And it is still a struggle for most doctoral researchers, doctoral students, to identify and define gaps in their studies. And yet it's very important. You need to identify that research gap, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, in this workshop, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce types of research gap. And I want you to sit relaxed, right, as we go through these research gaps. And I don't want you to miss anything because these are the things that are going to guide you in constructing and developing research gaps, ladies and gentlemen. So we are looking at that, right? And it's very important that we move into research gaps, right? What is a research gap, ladies and gentlemen? A research gap, right, can be defined as when the ability of the systematic reviewer to draw conclusions is limited. A research gap may be further developed, such as through stakeholder involvement in a prioritization and bring this into research needs. So research gap, remember, as we are defining it, is when the ability of the systematic reviewer to draw conclusions is limited. And I did also define a research gap in our previous workshop. That was workshop 5, ladies and gentlemen. And a research gap, ladies and gentlemen, may be further developed, such as through stakeholder involvement and in prioritization into research needs, ladies and gentlemen. So, and of course, if we look at the definitions given by Robinson, a research gap is considered to that's from Robinson and Saldaner and McCoy 2011. They have attempted to provide initial ideas in building taxonomy of research gaps. And in their model, they identified and described 5 types of research gaps, research gaps. So these are 5 types of research gaps based on 1, the population, 2, based on intervention, 3, based on comparison, 4, based on outcomes, and 5, based on settings, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see in this case, of course, the one that is, we can actually have given you a table, and I hope you can see the table here on the screen, just to demonstrate to you these 5 research gaps. Again, I have developed columns and rows. On the rows, I have those other 5 research gaps that I have articulated based on population, intervention, comparison, outcomes, and settings. That's what you'll see in the rows. But certainly, when we go to the columns, what will you see in the columns, ladies and gentlemen? I hope you are seeing that diagram here. You will see, for instance, the first one, we call it population. The second one is what we call intervention. The third one is what we call comparison. The 4th column is what we call the outcome. 5th is what we call the setting. 6th is what we call the free text of gap. And of course, the last column we have got not, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, the research gaps are based on a number of things like insufficient or no studies in that area, or limited number of studies. That's what we have now in the rows here, right, where you have small samples and so forth. You can actually challenge the current study, and you can base your research gap there. And of course, the other aspect will be in terms of the imprecise information or biased information. And here we'll be talking about high-risk bias or suboptimal study design. And of course, the other aspect will be inconsistent or unknown consistent results. So if there are unknown consistent results, then you can talk about a research gaps. In other words, there are inconsistencies in findings. And of course, the other one will be in terms of the right information, not having right information, and that could be another aspect. And of course, that can be used to challenge the traditional way of looking at things, ladies and gentlemen. Again, to give you definitions given by Robinson and Muller and Bloch and Kranz 2014, when they articulate a research gap, they build on the framework of Robinson et al. And of course, they conduct an exhaustive literature review. And in the process, they developed a theoretical framework for the development of research gaps. And their framework was based on Jacobs' 2011 theory on research problems, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, as you can see, Jacobs' 2011 identified 6 types of research problems. And these problems parallel research gaps as discussed by Muller, Bloch, and Kranz 2014, right? And of course, in their case, they do come up with what they consider to be a research gap. And their framework of research gaps consisted of 6 gaps, ladies and gentlemen. So the first one is what they call contradictory evidence gap. The second one is what they call the knowledge void gap. And the third one is what they call the action knowledge conflict gap. And the fourth one is what they call methodological gap. The fifth one is what they call evaluation void gap. And of course, the sixth is what they call the theory application void gap. And that is found in the Muller, Bloch, and Kranz 2014, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go through each of these gaps one by one, articulating exactly what these scholars actually meant and what is contained in them. We begin with the provocative exception gap, ladies and gentlemen. So the provocative exception gap occurs when a consistent and accepted conclusion is contradicted by the appearance of a new finding. This is what a provocative exception gap. First of all, you have got a consistent and accepted conclusion, but all of a sudden we see a new finding that contradicts the consistent and accepted conclusion. And of course, detecting such exceptions requires close scrutiny of a topic which might reveal some subtle change in understanding over time. Let me just give you an example. This is a text that we find in the literature on mentoring, for instance. In mentoring, especially when you read McManus and Russell, 1997, of course, they say, one line of mentoring research has consistently shown that mentors and mentees show higher levels of interpersonal attraction toward each other when they are matched by age, gender, and race, among other personal factors, ladies and gentlemen. And that is McManus and Russell, 1997, ladies and gentlemen. So in this case, we see a provocative exception example when another study comes up. And of course, in that new study, the findings are that, of course, however, taken from a different perspective, some studies have shown that when individuals are asked to identify the individual who has mentored them and has been most influential in their development, there is no apparent pattern in the matching of personal characteristics. So if you discover this, and yet the other fellows, McManus, they do actually indicate that, you know, this mentorship process is very, very important and influential in terms of matching individuals by age, gender, and race among personal factors. Then you discover that we have received a provocative exception gap, ladies and gentlemen. So let me now go to a second gap that we call contradictory evidence gap, ladies and gentlemen. Now, when contradictory evidence can be shown across findings at the same time, then of course you've got contradictory evidence gap. So you must be able to demonstrate and to show evidence of these contradictions over time. And in this instance, ladies and gentlemen, each set of results is compelling in its own right, but when viewed from a higher level of abstraction, the contradictions begin to appear. So that is, the researcher needs to analyze the findings from each stream of research, then begin to synthesize across the related streams to uncover how they may differ. And that's why I told you earlier on that, ladies and gentlemen, it's very hard for you to come up with the research gap without an extensive review of literature. So as PhD students, you must be aware that you have joined an enterprise that requires a lot of time, that requires a lot in terms of reading, that is highly demanding, and that's why you'll be in isolation most of the time. So if you are ready for it, you should know that really a PhD is a lonely journey in this perspective, because you'll be required to discover these gaps, and there's no way you will discover these gaps without what we call an intensive and critical review of literature, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go to the third gap that we call the knowledge gap, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the knowledge gap is is a common gap in the prior research. And of course, first, knowledge may not exist in the actual field of research, but in a related research domain. In this case, it may be necessary for you as a PhD student and scholars to refer to theories and literature from related research domains. So, if you find people introducing and using theories in their PhD work and papers, do not start questioning and say, well, theories are not necessary at all. No, we are saying if you're going to look at a knowledge gap, right, we see that knowledge gap is a common gap in the prior research. And we also know that in this endeavor, or in this industry that we are in, knowledge may not exist in the actual field of research, but in a related research domain. If you remember, I did give you what we call synthesized coherence, right? Where you discover that you're going to study disparate fields like psychology, you have to read marketing, you have to study finance, etc., to discover insights that you're going to use in your entrepreneurship thesis, ladies and gentlemen. So, and the second thing that you need to note with the knowledge gap here is that it might be the case that results of a study differ from what was expected. And this kind of discrepancy can motivate new research in this direction. And you'll find these ideas in the works of Muller, Bloch, and Kranz 2014, ladies and gentlemen. So let me take you to another gap or research gap that we call practical knowledge gap. And in this case, the action knowledge conflict, what we call the practical knowledge gap, right, occurs when individuals' professional behaviors differ from their espoused behaviors. So you observe the professional behaviors of individuals, but they are also espoused behaviors. Now, in this instance, the research problem could seek to identify if such a gap actually exists within a specific situation or topic, and the issues that contribute to the gap and the constraints that prevent individuals from behaving in professional situations as they might wish. Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, remember this is a practical knowledge gap. So you discover that literature says this, the profession says this, but the behaviors you actually see are totally different. So we call this the action knowledge conflict gap, or the action knowledge, right, conflict, which is the practical knowledge gap, ladies and gentlemen, in this case. So we need to understand what we are looking for. Let me present another type of research that I gave, knowledge gap that I gave you. And this is methodological conflict, ladies and gentlemen. Very common in the area of economics. But of course, in the other disciplines, this is actually downplayed. It's not really taken to be a serious research gap. Now, when we talk about methodological conflict, this is the use of one or another research methodology which may also help provide a source for a research problem, ladies and gentlemen. So if you use one or another research methodology, that may help provide a source of a research problem, you are talking about methodological conflict. And although there are numerous ways that researchers can manage bias or undue influence in their studies, the research methodology itself becomes a source of influence, though it is unlikely the researcher ever thought of it in this way, ladies and gentlemen. And let me just give you an example. For instance, one could argue that much of what we know about professional practice comes from survey research that asks respondents to complete an instrument of some kind. And indeed, the development of web-based platforms makes this approach all the more efficient to administer and the results to analyze, ladies and gentlemen. But at the same time, some of the most insightful understandings about the vagaries of professional practice come from the direct questioning of respondents using open-ended questions or specifically formatted questions such as the critical incident technique, ladies and gentlemen. So in this case, you may actually talk about a methodological conflict, a methodological gap, when you use a particular method to try and undertake that study. So that's why you're talking about methodology gap or conflict gap. Let me turn to another gap that we call the empirical gap, ladies and gentlemen. And an empirical gap is the type of gap that deals with gaps in the prior research. And this conflict deals with the research findings or propositions which need to be evaluated or empirically verified. I'll give you an example. The empirical gap often addresses conflicts that no study to date has directly attempted to evaluate a subject or topic from an empirical approach, ladies and gentlemen. And again, that is found in Muller, and that is Muller, Block, and Kranz 2014. So let's turn now to the population gap. And ladies and gentlemen, a population gap is a common gap recognized amongst researchers. There are always underserved populations that have been under-researched. And this gap is the type of research regarding the population that is not adequately represented or underrepresented in the evidence base or prior research. For example, in the area of gender, race, ethnicity, and what we have seen of recent in America, you know that very well. And certainly you'll find more ideas in Robinson et al. 2011. So let me take you now to another gap that we call the theoretical gap, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, I'm just giving you an overview of these gaps, but you may have an opportunity to study each of these gaps in detail. Now, the theoretical gap deals with the gaps in theory with the prior research. For example, if one phenomenon is being explained through various theoretical models, there might be a theoretical conflict. And researchers and scholars could examine whether one of those theories is superior in terms of the gap in the prior research. And theoretical gaps are a common occurrence in examining prior research on a phenomenon, ladies and gentlemen. So theoretical gaps are very common, and by theoretical gap, one is pointing at an area for which theory falls short, which means also that no published theory has addressed the concerned area. This is very common when you find somebody using one theory and he says, however, this theory does not address this kind of thing here, and therefore we need another theory to come in and reinforce the theory that we have so that we are able to capture reality out there. Because one theory does not adequately capture reality, and you have to bring in 2, 3 or more theories. And as you can see in contrast, literature gap covers theoretical gaps in addition to empirical gap. In the latter, a theory may exist, but still literature didn't address testing the theory, ladies and gentlemen. So the theoretical gap is an important gap, and for some of you who want to take up this challenge, please go ahead and take up this challenge. I'll also say it is possible that the same phenomenon may be explained through more than one theoretical model. You can use more than one theoretical lens, and such a discrepancy might provide an opportunity for studying the explanatory power of one theory over the other. For instance, examining learning theories based on behavioral cognitive theories has provided many researchers with a clear contrast from which to study and explain specific instrumental approaches, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, in this perspective, you could say, does learner interaction lead to higher learning outcomes because it affords individuals an opportunity to reflect on the relevance of the content, or because of the perceived value of the consequence that follows that particular response, ladies and gentlemen? So those are the things that we have. Those are the gaps, and I want to invite you to view the screen here and see the summary of these things. Again, as you'll see on the in the columns, I have 2 columns. The first column presents the gaps that I've been talking about, where you have the evidence gap, or the knowledge gap, the practical knowledge gap, and then methodological gaps. I'm sure you can see that on the screen, the empirical gaps, the theoretical gaps, the population gaps, ladies and gentlemen. And yet, when you go to the second column, as you can see, of course, we have attempted to summarize the aspects that relate to that. And that's why, for instance, under population, I'm sure you can see this here, that research regarding the population that is not adequately reproduced, or not reproduced, but represented or under-researched in the evidence base or prior research. And again, we have given you references. You can look for these journal articles. Then evidence gap, results from studies allow for conclusions in their own right, ladies and gentlemen. So again, study this table in detail. I hope you'll be able to pick a number of things that are very important. Ladies and gentlemen, as I move towards the end, I want to now introduce the concept of theory, because we need to understand what theory is. So when we talk about theory, theoretic knowledge offers an explanation of a phenomenon or a situation so that there is a full understanding of its components and how it works. And that's why in the previous workshops and also in my lectures on philosophy of science, I told you, and I actually gave you a simple definition of theory as probably a net that you cast out there in the world to capture that reality out there. If you can get a theory which is a net in this case, that can capture everything of a particular phenomenon, then that means you would have achieved much. But in most cases, most of the theories do not explain everything. And besides, the reality is very dynamic. Reality is complex. That's why we continue searching. We continue doing research because we want to understand the world. And I also want to refer you to my third lecture. If you recall, in the philosophy of science, and my third lecture did talk about the construction of the world. And I did talk about the scrutability theory, the Laplacian scrutability theory, and of course the Laplacian demon, ladies and gentlemen. So go and read. But when we talk about theory, we know that theoretical knowledge offers an explanation of a phenomenon or a situation so that there is a fuller understanding of its components and how it works. Now, theoretic knowledge and practical knowledge are sometimes contrasted and are presented as poles apart in most cases. However, they are frequently similar to conjoined twins. Theory informs practice, and practice informs theory. And that's why when you start doing research, we shall be asking you as a PhD student, what theory underpins, right, this kind of study? And you will be asked a number of questions. Where is the theoretical thread in your work? So we want to see this kind of thing. So whereas people think that theory is separate from reality, and the two are different, I'm telling you that they are frequently similar to conjoined twins, because theory informs practice and practice informs theory, ladies and gentlemen. So, since we are talking about these things, we need to understand the ontological position of the theory, right? And that's why I'm actually inviting you to go back and read and attend those lectures in the philosophy of science. So when you talk about ontological position of a theory, of course, Albert Einstein was firmly committed to a worldview based on three tenets. So if you go to Albert Einstein talks about three basic things. Of course, as you can see, he talks about realism, then he goes ahead and talks about locality, ladies and gentlemen, and talks about determinism, ladies and gentlemen. So let me discuss in, again, brief, in the interest of time, about these three things and what Albert Einstein actually meant. And therefore, these provide an ontological position of a theory. So one of them is realism. And that's why in my philosophy of science, I was talking about reality out there that is complex and dynamic. So according to Albert Einstein, when he came up with this concept or idea of realism, he assumes the physical world consists of objects. So that physical world, that reality out there consists of objects. And these objects exist from their own side. Therefore, that is independently of consciousness, and therefore we need to understand this. The second aspect is what we call locality, and locality assumes that an event in one place can affect an event in another place, and that's why he's talking about locality. If there is enough time for a signal traveling no faster than the speed of light to propagate from one another and to certainly determine the kind of influences that are taking place. So under locality, right, he was talking about sufficient time, right, being accorded to signals, being accorded to interactions of events or objects from one area to another area and other areas. So let's move to the third aspect, the ontological position of Einstein, and that is determinism, ladies and gentlemen. Determinism is the belief that every present or future event can be fully accounted for as the effect of past causes. So you are able to look at those events, right? You are able to look at the beliefs that every present or future event can be fully accounted for And of course, in this case, could be in terms of causes. So again, as you can see, this last tenet of Albert Einstein of determinism. The last tenet was encapsulated in Einstein's clause, where he said, God does not play dice. So he was looking at determinism. You are able to determine something. So let's now go to a theoretical contribution, and then I'll close in a moment. So a theory, again, I just want to remind you the definition I gave you. A theory is a coherent set of general propositions used as principles of explanation of the apparent relationships of certain observed phenomena. And of course, two purposes of theory. One is for understanding that kind of phenomenon out there, and then two is for prediction, ladies and gentlemen. And again, if we go back to the works of Karl Popper defines a theory, right? Karl Popper says, theories are nets cast to catch what we call the world, to rationalize, to explain, and to master it. We endeavor to make the mesh ever finer and finer, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in terms of reality, because again, since Karl Popper tells you that you have reality out there, and this is the net that is used to capture the reality. Now, reality can be captured at a number of levels, and the first level is what we call the abstract level. I hope you still remember our lecture on abstraction. You'll find that under lecture, I think, 13, lecture 14, and lecture 15, under the philosophy of science, where we look at models and modeling in econometrics, ladies and gentlemen. So the first level is the abstract level, where you have concepts and propositions. And in theory development, the level of knowledge expressing a concept that exists only as an idea or a quality apart from an object is what we call the abstract level. So at this level, you start with the concepts, and these concepts represent events in the wider environment. And then you come up with the propositions, right? So that is the abstract level of reality. From that, we move to the second level that we call empirical level. At the empirical level, you've got variables and hypotheses. And again, this is the level of knowledge reflecting that which is verifiable by experience or observation, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, at that material time, when you talk about a concept, or a construct, and that's what I covered. I think it was in our lecture 3, again, where we'll talk about the scrutability theory. But I think even lecture 2 of our philosophy of science, I did talk about that because lecture 1 was about the nature of understanding, and lecture 2 was a continuation of that. So if you go back to my lecture 1 and lecture 2 in the philosophy of science, you find the concepts and even constructs, and we attempt to distinguish concepts from constructs and variables, ladies and gentlemen. So when we talk about a concept, we are talking about a generalized idea about a class of objects, attributes or occurrences or processes that has been given a name, ladies and gentlemen. And then, of course, these are building blocks that abstract reality, right? And we have, you can use words like leadership, productivity, morale, gross national product, asset and inflation, and that kind of thing. So right now, I'm not talking about really the differences between these things, because even a construct is constituted by concepts, ladies and gentlemen. So those are the levels of abstracting reality, as we have seen. Certainly, I've given them to you, ladies and gentlemen. So we now move to theory building, right? And as you can see, we begin by looking at observations of objects and events. And I think, let me just show you this on the screen so that you understand exactly what we are talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, in this diagram, we've got what we call the theory building, right? This is a theory building diagram, a process of increasing abstraction, as you can see, right? You see, increasing abstraction because you start with the observations from reality, and then you move up to concept, propositions, and theories. So increasingly more abstract as you go up to theories. So we start with observations of objects and events. That is the reality out there. Then you use concepts to abstract these. Now from the concepts, of course, these are abstracts that represents events, and then from there you develop. Of course, concepts are turned into constructs sometimes, especially if you want to generalize, or if you want to look at categories of certain things. And then you move to propositions, and that's where you talk about propositional knowledge, and then from there we start theorizing, ladies and gentlemen. So this is the theory building process, which is a process of increasing abstraction. Again, God willing and time allowing, we shall move into theory building, ladies and gentlemen. But right now, our concern was about identifying research gaps, and I've given you those research gaps. And this is a continuation of lectures, not lectures, a continuation of the presentation of workshops on the concept of the terrain, the PhD terrain, understanding the PhD terrain, and navigating the PhD terrain. But previously, we have looked at concepts that relate to the problem. How do we identify a research problem? How do we identify a research topic? And so forth. So, and also we touched on research gaps, but this was specifically dedicated to the research gaps, and I've already taken you through that. But it's important also to realize the fact that as you identify those things, you must again theorize. You go into theory building, ladies and gentlemen. So this diagram that I've just shown you here, the diagram that you see on the screen here, is very, very important and pertinent. So I think in our next lecture, I don't think I should, in this workshop because of time, I may not take you to how we can link theory to practice, because again, that requires time. And I think I'll come back and talk about linking theory to practice by crafting what we call a theorized storyline. So in our next lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you to come back and attend a workshop on how we can craft a theorized storyline, and this will be a continuation of this. And then from there, we can actually move into other aspects that do matter. So at this material time, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for sparing some time to come and attend this workshop, and again to contribute in this workshop, but just to take you back and remind ourselves the things that we have gone through in this workshop, so that you do not forget, or somehow you find these lectures quite useful. We have again continued with our subject of understanding the PhD terrain, right? But PhD terrain now looked at from a different perspective of a research gap. And if you recall, in this lecture, I've taken you through the introduction, I've taken you through the theory of knowledge briefly, and locating or developing a research gap. I have also gone through making a theoretical contribution. One of the things that we have not achieved in this lecture, which I articulated earlier on, is linking theory to practice, and I think, and making a theoretical contribution. And that will be our next lecture, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you for having attended this workshop and for having really spared this time. I can always say, stay well, stay safe. I wish you a nice time. Bye, ladies and gentlemen.